Hello, and welcome to this social science-based podcast. In this podcast, Michael Todd, Social Sciences Communications Manager at Sage Publications, interviews Curtis Child, Assistant Professor at Brigham Young University, about his recent article published in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly entitled Tip of the Iceberg, The Nonprofit Underpinnings of For-Profit Social Enterprise. The paper can be found online at nbs.sagepub.com.
So let me start here. Dr. Child, you are an assistant professor of sociology at Brigham Young University, but perhaps you could tell me a little bit more about yourself and your academic journey. For example, I know you attended the well-regarded School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and I'm wondering how that all fits into your journey.
Sure. So I was an undergraduate at Brigham Young University, and that was the place where I really fell in love with the idea of a university and the academic life, and I was really taken by it and had thought about pursuing an academic career. I think I got some pessimistic advice that said maybe the academy, wasn't a great place to find a career, and I'm kind of by nature a risk-averse person, so I thought, well, what can I do that's a little bit more pragmatic? And I was aware of these public administration, public affairs programs that seemed kind of like, at least in my mind then, applied sociology. And so I'd applied and ended up going off to Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University, where you're right, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs there, and had a really nice experience, learned a lot. I was studying nonprofit management. I had the idea that maybe I'd go and work for a big nonprofit like the Red Cross or something, and that would be it. When I got there, I just sort of by dumb luck, one of the faculty members who was over the training in nonprofit management, whose name is Kirsten Gromberg, I had a chance to start working with her doing some research, and this was just an opportunity that came up, and I had been in her class, and I started doing research, and we were researching nonprofit organizations, and she, it turns out, was a sociologist. And the more I got to know her and the more I looked at her life, and I thought, I really kind of enjoy studying nonprofit organizations, maybe even more than I would enjoy working in them. And, through some conversations with her and others, I decided, maybe I want to kind of pursue this. So I finished my degree there and then applied to sociology doctoral programs and ended up moving over to Indiana's sociology doctoral program. But the impact or the influence of my training in the public affairs program would sort of last. And so I had lots of great relationships with faculty members over there, and sort of my research interests that were part of my doctoral studies were shaped and formed in large part in my experience doing the public affairs master's degree. So I've continued, for example, to study nonprofit organizations throughout my doctoral years and into my early academic career until now. And that's kind of my trajectory from when I started thinking about having an academic life, moving to something a little bit more applied and professional, and then coming back full circle into sociology.
But I noticed, though, that a lot of your study is at the nexus of nonprofits and for-profit businesses.
That's right. So my first independent piece of scholarship, that I conceived of on my own and did the data analysis and wrote up on my own, was looking at nonprofits and how they were or were not business-like in their efforts to accrue funding. So I was looking at their reliance on commercial types of revenues. What became interesting to me was this sort of boundary or this dividing line between nonprofits and business, the differences between these sectors. There's kind of legal distinctions. There's in some cases moral and other distinctions. And so, when I first started researching this nonprofits, I was interested in that boundary, but looking at it from the nonprofit side. As I continued on, my later research was really just the flip side, looking at businesses and how they were nonprofit-like in their sort of attention to social mission and things like that. So I really see these as two sides of the same coin.
And the specific businesses that you focused on, at least in the earlier part of your career, was on the apparel industry, if I understand correctly. And if that's correct, I'm wondering if you learned there is applicable to other industries that are outwardly proclaiming their corporate social responsibility credentials, such as coffee, whether it's shade-grown, free trade, etc., or lumber, or similar such endeavors.
Yeah, so I did spend a lot of my graduate school days and then into my early career studying the apparel industry. We were mostly interested in how social movements or social movement activists were targeting corporations, not just states, but corporations as well. And then the question became, well, how do they decide which corporations to target and which ones to leave alone and so on. And one of the findings or the insights that came out of that research was that corporations that invest a lot in their kind of corporate image were the ones who were more likely to get targeted. Insofar as the applicability to other industries is concerned, our research did just focus on apparel, so I can only speak directly to that. But other people, and I'm thinking of Braden King at Northwestern, have done similar work using different samples and have found similar types of things. And so, yeah, I think it's bigger than the apparel industry. You know, we were looking at the apparel industry in the 1990s specifically, but I think my intuition and additional research from others suggests that this is something that extends or is transferable beyond that particular case.
It's interesting you were talking about companies that have reputations that they're attempting to preserve, especially when it comes to corporate social responsibility. And so I see a lot of companies that get pulled into these conversations are, say, an Apple or a Google, are companies that maybe are low-hanging fruit in that respect, more so than, say, a metal-bashing company or industrial fasteners or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when a company proclaims itself as somehow a cut above or better than the average or in some way morally superior to others, I think they make themselves an attractive target. I think we see that in the political world, and so I don't think it's just about corporations, but I think it applies to corporations as well.
Well, I wondered if when a company says that our goal is to don't be evil, is that equivalent to do be good?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think they're the same. Don't be evil strikes me as a pretty low bar, whereas do be good is something different. It's probably better, but then you run into really thorny questions about what is good, whose good are we talking about, variations of good, the difference between doing good, things like creating jobs, which is kind of part and parcel of the corporate or capitalist enterprise, and then the difference between that and trying to do good, like, say, explicitly trying to solve social problems. So I think it gets really tricky. I think that's part of the reason why this is an interesting area to study. So to get back to your question specifically, yeah, I think those are different. I think don't be evil and do be good are different, but I think do be good is itself a very kind of problematic statement. When a company says we do good, what do they mean and how much good is that? How much good could they be doing? Is their good the same as my good? And who gets to say what's good? And it's become, I think, quite an easy phrase to sort of throw around. And I guess I'll add here that I do think that there are some sincere people who are really trying to do good. So I don't have a totally pessimistic view of the people at the helm of these organizations, but I also think it's an easy thing for publicity and for marketing to adopt, even when a company's real intention is not to address social problems, but maybe it's a way of pitching themselves to focus on the bottom line.
Which is kind of interesting in your current scholarship, where we see, again, this kind of nexus between presumably sincere for-profit businesses that have a conscience and nonprofits. And so in your latest paper in the journal Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, you look at how nonprofits, and I think you use the term civil society there, offer a scaffold for what we might call responsible for-profits. And so I realize there's a lot of time and effort that went into your study, but I'm wondering if you could briefly describe your findings.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, and then you can follow up if you want of more detail. I went into studying the fair trade and socially responsible investing in industries for other reasons than what became this paper. I was interested in how these businesses that say they do good and do well at the same time, that they have this double bottom line. I wanted to figure out what kind of problems this might create inside the organizations that are trying to balance these two goals, these two missions. What happened as I was studying them, though, I noticed that the businesses talked a lot about their dependencies on elements of civil society. And so I'm thinking of nonprofits and NGOs, churches, social movement activists, and the like. When I heard them saying that, I realized that it seemed at odds with lots of the fanfare surrounding market-based efforts to address social problems. So there seemed to be a lot of people talking about for-profit strategies to address social problems as preferable to something like philanthropic or charitable approaches. But what I was saying was that they really go hand in hand. The for-profit efforts would have had a very hard time sustaining themselves if it weren't for the support they were receiving from NGOs and churches and activists and so on. So the paper is my effort to sort of make this explicit and to shed light on what kind of resources and other reliances for-profits have on civil society. And so in the paper I identify three, and I don't suggest that these are the only ways that they rely on civil society, but these were three that were common in the cases that I studied. So just to give you some examples, one was for financial resources. This was apparent in the fair trade industry, where these fair trade businesses had a hard time finding funding and support for their initiatives. And so what they did was rely on nonprofit organizations like Root Capital that kind of act like banks for these businesses, because traditional lenders are skittish about them, and they provide the kind of financing that makes their for-profit work possible. And so this is the analogy in the title of my paper, the tip of the iceberg. What we see is the tip of the iceberg, meaning we see a for-profit business and doing good in the world, a fair trade business, for example, doing some sort of good in the world, and we say, wow, these sort of market-based enterprises really are in some ways better than philanthropy or nonprofits. And what I was saying in the paper is if you scratch underneath the surface, you actually see a lot of effort from civil society that goes into making this possible. A couple other of the examples that I give are in terms of legitimacy, that these people still have a hard time trusting corporations, in a sense, that they're prioritizing a social mission over their sort of financial goals. And so they rely on nonprofits for legitimacy. And we see in the fair trade industry especially lots of certification and labeling efforts that are very much rooted in the nonprofit NGO world. And then the final thing that I looked at was, and this comes more from the sustainable or socially responsible investing industry, and that is that these kinds of organizations, say a socially responsible mutual fund, it makes its money, or a product that it sells is that we can invest your money in a more moral, ethical, environmentally friendly way than the typical mutual fund down the street. But in order to do that, these mutual funds need to have lots of information about what's going on inside of companies or on the ground where companies are producing and manufacturing and so on. And that's not the kind of information that these mutual funds have on their own. What struck me was in my conversations and interviews with fund managers and research analysts, they relied extensively on social activists, labor groups, churches, and these other, again, what I'm referring to as elements of civil society to get the kind of information they needed to produce the product that they were selling in the for-profit marketplace.
I want to come back to a lot of the points that you made, but I want to veer off on one quick tangent. Since we have somewhat of an academic audience for these podcasts, I know you teach qualitative methods, and so I was wondering if you could briefly explain what methods you used in this research.
Sure. So the primary method was the in-depth interview, and as much as possible, I tried to do these in a face-to-face setting. I had an NSF grant, and I spent some time traveling to places like the Bay Area in California, sometime in Chicago. I went to Portland and some other places, New York, where progressive kind of businesses tend to cluster, and some of these investing, Boston as well, these investing companies tend to locate. And I sat down with people and had conversations, got them to tell me about what's going on in their organization, the kind of challenges they have. So that was a helpful thing. In the fair trade industry, I talked mostly to business owners, and in some of these coffee firms, you have coffee buyers who go out and travel the world and taste coffee and meet with local producers and bring it back and make arrangements. So I interviewed some of them as well. And in the investing industry, I talked to portfolio managers and research analysts primarily. Besides that, I did, I guess, more traditional ethnographic field work. I attended some industry conferences and meetings where I took field notes and kind of got a feel for what was happening in these industries. And even though that doesn't make it into the paper as much, that was actually a crucial part of the research, and just giving me a sense for what was happening, the way these organizations communicated with each other, to each other, taught each other, kind of conversations they had, the ways that they would, say, represent themselves at trade shows and trade conferences and things like that. So those were the two primary ways that I collected data for the project.
I'm interested in the ecosystem that you worked in. You were working with the people in industry, whether they were bosses or employees. And I'm wondering if there would have been a role to include independent observers. And this is apart from either the documents and then the conferences and such that you attended, or consumers, since these are a lot of public-facing type materials.
Yeah, so I think that kind of source of evidence or data is always useful. In this particular project, I'm not sure they would have shed light on the specific research questions that I was interested in. So, for example, the extent to which for-profit businesses rely on elements of civil society is probably not dependent on what consumers think. But if we're talking about what it means to do good or to be good, that's when I think these independent observers and consumers' perspectives become more useful, right? It becomes less reliable in those cases to know what a company is saying about itself, because they're all going to say we do good and we love the environment, we love the world, and you know, we're not just sort of capitalist pigs. But for this paper, that wasn't so much of what I was relying on. And so whereas that kind of information is useful for other aspects of sort of my broader research agenda, for this paper I didn't think it was quite as necessary.
So there's a lot of ways that companies can choose to show that they're good actors, and you chose fair trade and socially responsible investing. And these are pretty different manifestations of a desire to do good. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure, they are very different in lots of ways, which I think was a challenge for the research, but also provided some utility in the analysis. They struck me as useful for a couple of different reasons, despite their differences. One is that while there's lots of businesses that say they can, do well and do good, they're scattered throughout lots of different types of industries, which makes comparisons really tricky. The fact that these are, in fact, industries, that there is a fair trade industry with lots of organizations more or less trying to accomplish the same thing, was helpful because I could rule out a lot of other stuff that was going on. So in other words, if I looked at an organization and said, why is this organization doing the things that it does, I could at least rule out that this wasn't because I'm looking at 30 organizations in 30 different industries, all with different structures and supply chains and so on. So that was helpful, that I could narrow it down to two industries within which there were lots of fairly similar organizations. Number two, there are also two of the more visible industries where organizations are self-consciously trying to do good. So I make the argument that these are sort of on the leading edge of doing social enterprise type stuff. Finally, the fact that they are so different is actually helpful in a way. If we see patterns that are similar across two very different places, then it suggests that the results aren't just a feature of one peculiar industry, right? So the fact that I was seeing this phenomenon of businesses relying extensively on these networks and elements of civil society and was helpful for me making the conclusion.
It's interesting when you talk about a lot of these things. To me, I always think of them as kind of left-leaning, to come from the left side of the U.S. political spectrum. But then earlier you said that there were a lot of businesses that cite either a religious or a spiritual ethos for their actions. One of the examples we think of is Hobby Lobby, which perhaps muddies the water a little bit. But I'm wondering, is that accurate that these things do span the ideological spectrum?
Yeah, I think you're right that this isn't just a lefty phenomenon, and I think that was surprising to me. And when I did the research, I guess I knew it cognitively, but in talking to and interviewing some of the people in the trade, it became apparent. This was especially obvious in the socially responsible investing community. So lots of mutual funds support very left-leaning issues. They're against weapons manufacturing, they're pro-environment, they're pro-gender equality, and so on. So there's lots of issues that are consistent with, as you said, a sort of left-leaning U.S. political atmosphere. But some are very politically conservative. There are mutual funds that refuse to invest in companies that make drugs or devices that can be used for abortions. They're against companies that are perceived as having a pro-gay agenda, and so on. So I think it's fair to say that you can find the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum. And I don't have hard data on this, but I do think it's right that you can find socially responsible mutual funds across the political or ideological spectrum, although I'd still say they weigh more heavily on the left-leaning side.
And I'm wondering if these nonprofit civil society influences create a scaffold for the for-profit but responsible world. Having a scaffold and actually getting something done are two different things. So I'm wondering, does civil society keep their for-profit cousins' feet to the fire?
Yeah, I think they do in many ways, but the way that question is phrased is maybe a little bit more contentious than what I observed. I think that these relationships were quite collaborative. Maybe they weren't collaborative in the sense that people are sort of formally coming together and saying, hey, let's strike a collaboration. Maybe the actors involved don't even know each other, but there's this kind of mutually beneficial action happening. So you're right that some of this can be holding feet to the fire, but what I talk about mostly in the paper is very much mutually supportive.
So we don't necessarily have to see people that are going to chain themselves to a tree to prevent the loggers from getting to it when I'm dealing with a company that also acknowledges the fact that the old-growth forest needs to remain.
That's right, yeah.
So something that you mentioned before, and I'm just wondering about the double, and I've even heard of the triple bottom line, and that is doing good, based on your research, truly compatible with doing well?
Yes, I think companies can do both, and there's been a lot of research, a lot of empirical research on, whether companies benefit, if there's a return, financial return to corporate responsibility. There's volumes of research that have been done. And I think it's clear that companies really can have some element of doing good or being responsible citizens and also be successful companies. Where I think it gets interesting, though, is thinking of things less in a binary and more in terms of gradations. How much good are corporations willing to do? How well do they need to do financially? One can imagine trying to do so much good, so much stuff that's in favor of the environment or addressing some social problem that it actually starts to hurt the financial bottom line. And like I said, I think that's where it gets really interesting. So while it is, to answer your question, easy to do both if your goals are modest, I don't think it's possible to maximize the benefits to society while also maximizing the financial returns to the company. There's going to be some give and take, and I think that point gets missed in much of the conversation. I think most of the popular conversation and much of the scholarship ignores the fact that there's lots of variation how much good a company can do, and if it tries to maximize the benefits it can create to society, then there's, in my mind, it's almost impossible to maximize the financial returns that it could possibly accrue.
So a balance is a more reasonable expectation.
Yeah, it's a balance, but I don't think you'll hear corporate executives saying it's a balance, right? The suggestion that we do good by doing well doesn't suggest, well, we do good enough so that we can do really well. The implication is that we're really doing good in the world, and that doesn't hurt our financial bottom line at all. I just have questions about that. I think it seems, I want to say logically impossible, but let's say it's logically nearly impossible to imagine scenarios where a company couldn't do a little bit more good in the world, however you define that, and have that not have some impact on their financial bottom line.
So given that, and then also based on your research, do you expect we're going to see more or less social enterprise going forward? And also, is this just something that we see in the Western world?
I think we're going to continue to see it. One of the reasons I say that is because it's become institutionalized as a standard way of doing things. So the kind of most basic way of thinking about companies doing good, corporate social responsibility, is very much ingrained. But what I think of as a more active way of corporations trying to do good or pursue some social mission has also been institutionalized. We have universities that teach courses in it, competitions and funding agencies and investors and lots of people who have demonstrated an interest in it. So there's too much infrastructure in place for me to say this is going to pass in the next couple of years. I think it's here to stay for a little bit. How long that stays, who knows? It's hard to predict well into the future, but I think it is going to be something that we see continue. As for whether it's a Western industrialized nation sort of phenomenon, I do think there's some element of that, and there does appear to be kind of in some cases, a very Western thing. But there's also ways that this has taken shape in other countries, other parts of the world, that may not look exactly like what we're talking about here, but has some of the elements. I haven't done this kind of cross-national research myself, but I know Janelle Curlin, who's a scholar at Georgia State University, she's written a book that looks at social enterprise in a global context, comparing what social enterprise looks like in Western Europe and compares that to Asia or other parts of the world. And so certainly she's found that there are things that look like social enterprise happening in places other than Western democracies.
Yeah, because it seems like it is such a Western type phenomenon, but then there are people like the justly famed Muhammad Yunus that are doing work that certainly seems to fit into what you're talking about.
Yeah, very much so, and I think that's a great example, and I cite him in the paper. I think actually in earlier drafts of the unpublished paper, I talk about him quite a bit more. I mean, I think microfinance and micro-enterprise kind of movements very much gave legitimacy to, and his work in particular in getting the Nobel Prize, all gave legitimacy to this idea that we can have businesses that are addressing social problems.
A lot of times in business, we'll hear somebody say something along the lines that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And so I'm wondering about some of the certification efforts. I'm thinking somewhat about fair trade, but also some of the other things that we might see. But certification efforts have their critics, and as do a lot of the labeling efforts where companies try and say this product is done sustainably or organically or something along that line. And I'm just wondering what your take is on these sorts of certification or labeling efforts.
I tend to think of this in pragmatic terms. So I don't think at this point I have a principled take on the form, labeling, and certification broadly. I think there's a lot going on though, and it's easy for consumers to be confused or misled. And I don't think that's good or that's helpful, because I think in that kind of environment it's easy for a labeling initiative or for a company that adopts labeling initiative to fool themselves or consumers into think that they're doing something that they're not. And so I think it's easy for a labeling initiative to gain traction even if it doesn't have very high standards. And sometimes consumers aren't aware that there's a difference between this type of certification or label and that type of certification or label. As long as they see something that looks like a label on their coffee, they feel good that it's been produced or sourced in a way that would meet high ethical standards. And I don't think that's the case. I really do think there are variations in the kind of quality of labeling and certification initiatives, and that's something that I think is not necessarily beneficial for the end consumer. So again, thinking about things pragmatically, I do think a certification or label can be useful, and if we're in an era where the state is in decline and corporations kind of rule the day, then maybe this is the best thing we can do. And if that's the best thing that we can do, then I think it can be useful. But if we sort of scratch underneath the surface and we see, well, there's a lot going on here, there's lots of opportunity for confusion, then I think that's where I start to become more concerned.
Plus, I think I've been trained as a consumer that when I see a label on something that says now with extra morality, I tend to believe I'm going to pay a premium for that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if we're ethical consumers, we might be okay with that if it really is producing something different, say on the ground in the coffee field. But if this is just a label that's been concocted for the sake of appeasing a market segment and really doesn't have any teeth to it, then not only have we been fooled into thinking that we're, sort of helping in some greater cause, but we're also paying a bit more for it, which is hard to make a strong argument for.
Now, academics are pretty famed for saying at the end of every project that more research is needed. And your own paper, as you mentioned, is titled Tip of the Iceberg, which also leads to that conclusion. But I'm wondering what's next for either your research or what do you think the field should be doing?
One of the things that this project got me interested in was thinking about the relevance of sector. And I think sector is something that we've taken for granted for a long time, and we think about for-profit corporations and nonprofit charities and so on, but organizations, for example, that exist in the fair trade industry straddle that boundary. And well, to put it this way, when I go to a conference and I present some research, I can put up a website or give some information about a nonprofit, and I show the homepage for a nonprofit and compare it to a homepage for a for-profit, and I ask people in the audience if they can tell the difference. And in many ways, they're very similar. And if you go into their stores, which I've done, it is sometimes hard to figure out, is this a charity or is this a for-profit? What's going on here? And that made me think about, well, what's the relevance of sector in these kind of progressive industries? Do they matter anymore? Is it still a relevant device for thinking about the organizational world? So I have a couple of papers with some of my colleagues on that very issue. One was how people choose when they're going to start a fair trade business or a fair trade nonprofit. How do they choose between deciding whether to incorporate as a business or incorporate in the nonprofit sector, and what matters to them? That's one thing I've written on. And the other is more about this kind of general meme that sector boundaries are blurring. And so I said, well, if sector boundaries are blurring, then certainly they're blurring in the fair trade industry, if anywhere. And then I report on some data with interviews from fair trade practitioners and ask them. The second paper reports on how people think about sector. Do they see it as blurred? Do they see it as irrelevant? And basically what I find is that for lots of reasons, these practitioners still feel like being a nonprofit or a for-profit matters in some consequential ways, which flies a little bit in the face of this swell of research that suggests that sector boundaries are blurring and maybe they don't matter all that much anymore.
Your current research and what you were just talking about, we've seen a lot of it we're talking about is the DNA going one way, going from the civil society to the responsible businesses. But I'm wondering, are you seeing kind of a reverse flow too, where hard-edged, and I mean that in the harshest sense of the term, hard-edged business ideas are filtering back into the nonprofit world?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think this sort of brings us back full circle to the research that kind of kicked off my academic career when I was in graduate school. And the preoccupation of that project was in thinking about nonprofit organizations and the extent to which they are incorporating business-like strategies. This is something that has gone not only into the nonprofit world, but also into public administration, to sort of government sector practice. And so, yeah, I think it goes both ways, and I think it's an interesting area to think about. What do we gain and lose by suggesting that charities should be business-like in their efficiency, in the strategies that they pursue, and so on. In some ways, it's really great, right? We like businesses because we think perhaps they're efficient, have this bottom line that is driving them to make decisions that are savvy. In other ways, I think it can be quite troubling if those values start to crowd out other kind of values for which we have long cherished the nonprofit sector, for being mission-oriented and not being only financially interested and so on. I'm open to the idea that this can be a useful kind of enterprise. Think about what do we learn from running businesses that might be applicable to nonprofit organizations. But I'm also probably more skeptical than most that this is always a wise thing to do. I think it can have troubling consequences.
Well, Professor Curtis Child, I appreciate your talking to me today, and I hope we're able to talk again on these issues.